Makkot, Daf Yomi Makkot, Self-Incrimination, באומר עדות שקר העדתי. The idea of Eidim Zomim is such a revolutionary idea that as we move through the Perek, each year we just add another stroke to the painting and it builds and we get an idea of how it works. There's no way, we wouldn't be doing it justice if we try to summarize right at the beginning all the different aspects. It's a very multifaceted topic that we build as we go through the Masechta. What's important in the Masechta altogether is to understand that Beit Din is very different from a secular court of law, and Adut is very different from evidence in a secular court of law, and Tashlumin and Onesh, payment and punishment in a Beit Din, is very different from payment and punishment in a secular court of law. What is the difference? Firstly, Beit Din's role is not to collect information and act on the information. Beit Din's role is to create a new reality. A reality which then initiates various responses to that reality. So it's actually a reverse role from a regular court of law. Regular court of law works in retrospect. What happened? And tries to establish the historic facts. The Beit Din, of course, will use historic facts as part of its reasoning, but its functioning is to look from here on. What is the situation that we have before us? The Beit Din creates that situation, almost irrespective of the facts, but of course based on the facts, but not only based on the facts. The Eidim, witnesses, again, are not just bringing information. Witnesses create a reality, as we'll see today, for a Beit Din. And it's such a reality that it cannot be undone excepting by Eidim Zomim. That's the only way that you can undo the reality of a witness. For example, as we'll see in our Gemara, if a witness comes and tells us a story, we cross-examine the witness and we accept the story. And Beit Din paskins. And then the witness comes along and says, well, okay, it was all just ki'ilu, I was just joking, I wasn't serious, this wasn't for real. We still carry on acting, we don't accept his second opinion. Even though it's clear that he really wasn't, he really was being untruthful in the beginning. We know that he was being untruthful in the beginning, or we strongly suspect he was being untruthful in the beginning. The reality which his Eidus has created is a non-reversible reality. We have the same thing with the laws of Kiddush HaChodesh. When witnesses come and give evidence about the moon, it's found that it's right, it's wrong. Once we have accepted evidence and the Beit Din has given a determination based on that evidence, that creates a new reality, very difficult to reverse the reality that they've created. And that's why Eidim Zomim is such an innovative and powerful tool. And then when it comes to payment and punishment is not just compensation. Payment and punishment is also a means of kapara. It's a means of atonement for the person who did wrong. If a person damaged his friend, the one issue is there's an issue of justice. The friend has to be compensated. But there's another spiritual issue. That is, how does the person who caused the damage, or the criminal, if there was a crime involved, do kapara? How does he do atonement? And part of his atonement has to be the payment. Sometimes it's compensation, sometimes it's more than compensation. So we need to bear those principles in mind as we work through the Masechta. There's a Rambam on Ilchot Eidim Zomim in Eidus Perek Yudchet where he says, Chiyuv ha'Eidim Zomim l'shalem b'makom shechayavim l'shalem. The obligation of Eidim Zomim to pay when they are obligated to pay, knasu. This is a knas. This is not compensation. Which of course makes sense because we know Eidim Zomim have to pay before any loss was incurred. So two witnesses come and they say A owes B $1 million. Before A pays B the $1 million, those witnesses are proved to be false through Hazzama. Those witnesses have to pay A the $1 million they planned to cause him to have to fork out. That's not compensation. A didn't lose anything yet. He hasn't paid anything yet. So clearly it's a knas, as the Rambam says, and Rabbi Akiva said that at the bottom of Daf Beis Amud Aleph. Ulefichach ein mishalmin al pi atzman. And therefore, as with any knas, you can't self-impose a knas. A fine, a payment which is not compensation, payment which is intended for atonement and not for compensation, you can't impose upon yourself. A Beit Din has to impose that. Punishment, which is what a knas is, has to be imposed by a Beit Din. You can't self-impose punishment. And so if a person comes along and says, I'm an Eid Zomem, I wasn't actually there that day, then, says the Rambam, he doesn't pay. The basis of that is in a difficult Gemara, and we're only going to touch on the conversation of the Gemara, not even the conclusion of the Gemara. And initially, as I was preparing this, I wanted to do with you the Ritvo and the Tosfos and the Tosfos Rabbeinu Peretz. There's an interesting discussion, but at the end I just decided if we just enjoy the Ritvo, that's more than enough for the time that we have available. Rav Yehuda was giving a shir in the name of Rav. He was quoting Rav when he gave the shir. And he quoted Rav as saying, Eid Zomem meshalem lefi chelko. An Eid Zomem pays his proportionate amount. What does that mean? So now the yeshiva is discussing this shir of Rav Yehuda that he gave in the name of Rav. Mai meshalem lefi chelko. What did Rav mean? If he meant each of the two Eidim Zomamin pay half. Tanina mishalshlim b'mammon ve'mishalshlim b'malkot. We've already know that. That's already established in a Mishnah, in a Brisa. We know that he only pays proportionately. So that can't be the big chidush that Rav came up with. Ela kagon di'itzum chad minayo. So he must be talking about a case where only one of the two witnesses becomes an Eid Zomem. So two other witnesses come and say, we don't know about Reuven, but Shimon wasn't there that day. The Mishalem Palga today, then he pays his half. Ask the Gemara, Mi Mishalem, is that true? We don't kick in the laws of Eid Zomem unless both of them are found to be Eidim Zomemin. You can't do it halfway. You can't make one of them an Eid Zomem and make him pay his half. So that cannot be what Rav means. So once again, we're stuck. What did Rav mean when he said this, that each one pays their share? Omar Rove. So Rove comes with an approach which doesn't remain the end point of the conversation, but Rove's assumption is very important to analyze. באומר עדות שקר העדתי. He comes along and he says, after giving evidence, this witness says, I was giving false evidence. That was it. What I said was not true. So the Gemara goes on to say, Kol Kamina, how can one do that? Kivan she'igid shuvei nechozer umagid. We've just discussed. Once a witness is given evidence, it creates a new reality. You can't undo the reality himself. You would need two other edim to undo the reality. How can you just back out? But let's go into Rova's initial assumption. So there are two questions that we've got to look at. The one is, if he says, I gave false evidence, sorry guys, I was just joking, it's not real. Why does Rav call that an Eid Zomem? What's Zomem about it? He's admitting I didn't do it. I didn't do it. That's a person who's acknowledging. Why does Rav call him an Eid Zomem? The first important thing to understand in Rav's approach. And the second is, why does he have to pay anything if he hasn't yet caused a loss? He's not an Eid Zomem. Clearly he's not an Eid Zomem, because nobody's come and done Hazzama. He did it himself. He said, I was telling a lie. So I'm not an Eid Zomem. I'm just acknowledging that I told a lie. Why do I have to pay? The only time I would have to pay, even though I caused no damage, is if I'm a real Eid Zomem caused by two other Eidim coming and saying, this guy wasn't there at that time. What's the basis of the payment? When Rav says, Meshalem lefi chelko, and Rava says, we're talking about a person saying, Edut sheker העדתי, I gave false evidence. How do you put those two together? That's what the Ritvo talks about. It's what Tosfos talks about, what the Rishonim talk about. And let's go through pieces of the Ritvo. Omar Rava b'omer idut sheker ha'adati. He says, Mayri b'shelo huzmu klal. There are no Eidim Zomemim yet, different from Tosfos. There are no Eidim Zomemim involved. This is just him making an admission. Ela she'echad mehem izim la'atzmo. But one of them acknowledged. He was mezim himself. Look at those words. Where does the Ritvo get it from that you can be mezim yourself? Well, he gets it from Rava, but where does Rava get it from? From Rav. Where does Rav get it from? Lomar idut sheker adnu kilo hayinu mitzuyim bo'oto makom o'oto yom klal. He doesn't just say, I was joking. He says, not only was my evidence false, I wasn't even there that day. I wasn't in the country that day. And with that, the Ritvo explains the first question. Why does Rav call it an Eid Zomem? Because he uses the terminology of an Eid Zomem, even though he himself is not an Eid Zomem. And the only way that I've been able to understand this is with what we learned yesterday, that part of the purpose of aid zomeim is so that the aid should have skin in the game, that the aid should be at risk for giving false evidence. Why do we want him to be at risk? First prize would be he decides not to give false evidence. He's on his way to court and he decides, I'm not doing this. This is too dangerous. Second prize would be he goes to court and he gives false evidence and now he gets worried. He thinks things are going on. He sees the lawyers whispering to each other. Maybe an aid zomeim is going to show up. So he admits. Before anything else happens, he says, I did a shit. So that's great. We should be happy with that. That is Hazzama. That, in fact, is the greatest form of Hazzama. It's almost secondary if he's not meizim himself. First prize again is he doesn't give the false evidence. Second prize is if he gives the false evidence, he's meizim himself. Third prize is eidim zomim kam. But this is part, the way the Ritva learns it, this is part of the Hazzama process. Self-Hazzama is a possibility, according to the Ritva's understanding at this point. And then he goes on to answer various different questions on that. And he says, towards the bottom of the first paragraph, Shari yotzei midvarav shehu modeh sheyesh lechaveiro mamon etzlo. So why does he have to pay? He has to pay because he's admitting that Reuven is owed money by him. Reuven is the person who is accused of owing the money. These two witnesses come along, he's one of them, and he says Reuven owes Shimon the money. Reuven doesn't owe him the money. It's this aid is trying to create a new obligation. What he succeeds in doing is creating an obligation for himself. The moment he tries to cause Reuven to have to pay Shimon money illegitimately, by means of false evidence, at that point, he becomes an aid sheker and he obligates himself to be responsible for that. And in fact, we'll take it further, as the Ritva will explain. Can he then back out of it? Again, let's look at the situation. He comes to court, he says, Reuven owes Shimon $1 million. Reuven doesn't owe Shimon $1 million. And then he's about to back out. He backs out. Before Reuven pays anything, he says, sorry, I wasn't there. I'm making it up. It's all nonsense. What does the Beit Din now say? The Beit Din says, sorry, we've accepted your evidence. You can't back out. Reuven, pay $1 million. Reuven says, but there's no evidence that I owe him $1 million. Says the Beit Din, we're sorry, we've already accepted the evidence. There's a new reality. The new reality is from now, you owe him $1 million. However, who was Gorem? Who caused the $1 million? The witness. Now you can claim $1 million back from the witness. That's how it works according to the Ritva. So that idea that the Beit Din doesn't back out, that's the principle of Kivan Shehigid Shuvuk Eno Chozer Magid. Once a person has given evidence, you can't reverse the evidence. What you can do is go back to the cause of the responsibility, which is the false witness, and you can claim from him, and that's why he has to pay. Now we understand why he's saying, I accept that I owe this man $1 million because I caused him to have to pay the other person $1 million. Just as if a person acknowledges that I took ribit from you, you have to pay it back. According to the view in Bava Kama, that when you have to pay something as kofar, as kapara, as atonement, whether it's compensation or it's a knas, it's still considered a form of a monetary obligation. It's not in the category of punishment. So he learns a little differently to the Rambam. The Rambam says it's a straight knas. The Ritva wants to learn, even if it's a class, it has a principle of mammon. It's kufra mammona. You're paying this person as an indebtedness. The moment you cause him to be obligated to pay his counterpart in court the $1 million, at that moment you become obligated to compensate him, because otherwise you will never be atoned for this terrible thing you did. Although nothing came out of it. At the end of the day, you intervened before anything terrible happened. You admitted you'd made a mistake. But just doing that, going to court and schlepping somebody to court and putting him through that, and then the court has to implement it, that's a terrible aveira, that's a terrible sin that you've caused, and you need kapara, and you do that through offering it, through obligating yourself to pay. But then the Ritva goes on to explain the Gemara's next question. And the Gemara's next question, which is, Kivan shegid shuven u'chezer u'magid, He can't withdraw that statement. Ask the Ritva ve'ikele meida kapir zeh. Adrabah, lefi she'enu yachol lachzor bo meiduto v'anidon mitchayev al peim hu chayav l'shem mafsido beiduto. What does the Gemara mean? Oh my goodness, we can't reverse it now. Says the Ritva, the fact that you can't reverse it is why he has to pay. That's in fact if you could reverse it, nobody would have to pay anything. It's the fact that you can't reverse it that obligates him to pay. Answers the Ritva, yes, that's true. That's not what the Gemara is answering. The Gemara understands the process. Witness comes, gives false evidence, Reuven owes Shimon $1 million. Beit Din has to enforce that, because kivan she'egid shuven echozer magid, even though witness says, I wasn't there, it's all a lie. Still Beit Din has to enforce that, but they take the money from Reuven the witness. But that's not what the Gemara is concerned about. What the Gemara is concerned about is the loshon of Rava calling it an eid zomem, the mashma midin eid zomem mishalem velo midin eid garmi. This is garmi, this is indirect damage, which is required in this case to be paid. It's got nothing to do with eid zomem. This is not a case of eid zomem. That's what the Gemara is getting upset about, just linguistics. Why does Rava use the word eid zomem? We agree with Rava. He has to pay his share. Why does he have to pay his share? Because he caused a loss. Why did he cause a loss? Because kiven shehegid shuvene chozer magid. Once he's given his evidence, Beit Din has to act on that. So that's all fine. But why call it eid zomem? Because the underlying principle of eid zomem is that the damage has not yet been done. If the damage has already been done, then you're obligated because of garmi. You caused loss, so you have to compensate for the loss. The chiddush of eid zomem is even if you didn't cause loss. Says the Ritva, what the Gemara is worried about here is he has caused loss, because the Gemara, kivan she'egid shuvei nechazer magid, once you've given evidence, you can't reverse it. If you can't reverse it, Reuven has to pay Shimon. If Reuven has to pay Shimon, where does he get compensated from? He gets compensated from the false witness. That's all fine, and it's because of Dina de Garmi. It's got nothing to do with eid zomem. On the contrary, it cannot be eid zomem because the damage has been done. Eid zomem only works when the damage hasn't been done. And that's why the Gemara then changes its mind and takes a completely different tack and goes along the lines of Ela Bomer Haidani v'huzamnu beveis din ploni. We gave evidence and we were found to be mezidim. We're talking about a second court case altogether. The Gemara goes on a different track. But what we begin to learn from the Ritva is a little bit of a deeper insight into the way evidence works, into the responsibility that results from the giving of evidence, the necessity to compensate for loss that occurred from false evidence. That responsibility is din garmi. I was the cause of that loss, and therefore I have to compensate. The chidush of eid zomem, even if loss wasn't occurred, provided two new witnesses come and create a new reality, then I have to pay even if the loss wasn't incurred, because that's the only way that, as being a terrible wrongdoer in this case, I can find some form of kapara, I can find some form of atonement.